The gunshot that killed Owen Vance rang out on a Tuesday morning in late October, and his daughter Ophelia knew from the moment she heard it that her entire world had just shattered into pieces too small to ever put back together. She was 22 years old, standing in the kitchen of their small ranch house outside Taylorsville, Utah, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift past the window when the sound reached her ears. By the time she ran outside, her father was already gone, lying in the dirt beside the corral with his eyes staring up at the gray sky, and the three men who had shot him were riding away at a gallop toward the mountains. The sheriff came and took statements. The neighbors came and brought casseroles. The reverend came and said words about heaven and peace and the mysterious ways of the Lord. But none of it mattered to Ophelia, because the only person who had ever truly mattered in her life was now lying in a pine box in the cold ground behind the church, and she was alone in a way that made her bones ache. Her father had been a horse trader, one of the best in Utah territory. He had taught her everything he knew about breaking wild mustangs and reading the temperament of a stallion just by watching how it moved. They had worked side by side for years, ever since her mother had died of scarlet fever when Ophelia was 12. Now the ranch was hers, along with the debts her father had accumulated, and the knowledge that the men who killed him would probably never face justice because they worked for Harrison Webb, the richest cattle baron in 3 counties, and Harrison Webb owned the sheriff and half the judges in the territory. Ophelia spent the next 3 weeks trying to hold things together. She fed the horses and mucked out the stalls and repaired the fence line where it had come down in a windstorm. She paid what bills she could and avoided the ones she could not. She spoke to no one unless she had to and went to bed each night so exhausted that she fell asleep before the grief could catch up with her. But it always found her in her dreams, and she would wake up gasping, reaching out for a father who was no longer there. The first real snow came on a Wednesday in mid-November. Ophelia woke to find everything white and silent, the world transformed into something both beautiful and foreign. She made coffee and stood at the window, watching the flakes fall in thick curtains, and that was when she decided that she could not stay here anymore. This place was full of ghosts. Every corner of the ranch held a memory that stabbed her in the heart. Her father teaching her to rope a calf in the south pasture. Her father laughing as they raced their horses across the creek. Her father sitting on the porch at sunset, telling her stories about her mother. She needed to leave. She needed to go somewhere new where the past could not follow her, where she could breathe without feeling like her lungs were filled with broken glass. She had a cousin in California who had written to her after the funeral, offering her a place to stay if she ever needed it. California seemed impossibly far away, but that was exactly what Ophelia wanted. Distance. Space. A chance to become someone other than the girl whose father had been murdered. It took her 2 days to arrange everything. She sold most of the horses to a trader from Provo who gave her a fair price. She packed what belongings she could fit into 2 saddlebags and a small trunk. She made arrangements for a neighbor to sell the ranch and send her the money once he found a buyer. And then, on a Friday morning when the sky was low and gray with the promise of more snow, she saddled her mare, a beautiful chestnut named Ruby, and prepared to leave the only home she had ever known. She was tying her trunk to the back of a small wagon she had borrowed when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She looked up and saw a rider coming down the road from town, moving at a steady trot. As he got closer, she recognized him, and her heart did a strange little skip that she tried very hard to ignore. His name was Kieran Jennings, and he was the finest cowboy in Taylorsville by anyone's measure. He was 26 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a quiet manner that made people trust him on instinct. He worked at the Miller Ranch, the second largest cattle operation in the county, and Ophelia had known him since they were children. They had gone to the same one-room schoolhouse, back when Taylorsville was barely more than a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. They had sat on opposite sides of the room, boys on one side and girls on the other, and she had watched him out of the corner of her eye, fascinated by his stillness, the way he seemed to think carefully before speaking. As they got older, their paths had crossed occasionally. At dances in the town hall, where he asked her to waltz exactly once and held her so carefully she felt like she might break. At church picnics, where they made polite conversation about the weather and the harvest. At the general store, where they would nod to each other across the shelves of dry goods and canned vegetables. Ophelia had always been aware of him in a way she could not quite explain, a kind of magnetic pull that made her skin tingle when he was nearby. But she had never acted on it because her father needed her, and because Kieran seemed content with his work and his solitary life, and because some things were easier left unspoken. He reined in his horse when he reached her yard and dismounted in one smooth motion. He was wearing a heavy coat against the cold, and snowflakes caught in his hair and on his shoulders. His eyes, which were a startling shade of blue-gray, found hers, and she saw something in them that made her throat tighten. "Ophelia," he said, and just the sound of her name in his voice made her want to cry. "I heard you were leaving." "News travels fast in this town," she said, trying to keep her voice light. She turned back to the wagon, checking the knots on the ropes that held her trunk in place. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she hoped he did not notice. "Are you really going to California?" he asked. He took a step closer, and she could smell the scent of leather and wood smoke that always seemed to cling to him. "Yes," she said. "I have family there. A cousin in San Francisco. She said I could stay with her for as long as I need." "That is a long way," Kieran said quietly. "I know." Ophelia pulled the rope tight, perhaps tighter than necessary. "But there is nothing for me here anymore. The ranch is being sold. My father is gone. I need a fresh start." She could feel him watching her, could feel the weight of his gaze on the side of her face. She kept her eyes on the wagon, on the trunk, on anything but him. "What if there was a reason to stay?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ophelia felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to look at him, wanted to ask him what he meant, but she was afraid of what she might see in his eyes, afraid of what she might feel if she let herself hope. "There is not," she said, and her voice came out harsher than she intended. "There is nothing here for me now." Kieran was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low and rough. "I understand. I just wanted to say goodbye, and to tell you that I am sorry about your father. He was a good man." "Thank you," Ophelia whispered. She swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "Be safe on the road," Kieran said. "Winter is coming on fast." "I will be fine," she said. "I have been taking care of myself for a long time." She heard him take a breath as if he was going to say something else, but then he stopped. She heard the creak of leather as he swung back into his saddle. She heard the soft thud of his horse's hooves as he turned to leave, and that was when something inside her broke. "Kieran," she said, and she turned to face him. He stopped immediately, looking back at her with such intensity that it stole her breath. "I appreciate you coming to say goodbye," she said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. He nodded slowly. "Goodbye, Ophelia." He rode away, and she watched until he was out of sight. Then she finished loading the wagon, climbed onto the seat, and took up the reins. Ruby was tied to the back, and she nickered softly as if sensing Ophelia's distress. Ophelia took one last look at the ranch, at the house where she had grown up, at the barn where she had learned to ride, at the corral where her father had died. Then she turned the wagon toward the road and started west. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that stuck to her eyelashes and melted on her cheeks like tears. The road out of Taylorsville wound through gently rolling hills covered in sagebrush and juniper. In the distance, the Wasatch Mountains rose up like a wall, their peaks already white with snow. Ophelia had traveled this road 100 times with her father, going to Salt Lake City to sell horses or to Provo to buy supplies. But she had never traveled it alone, and she had never traveled it with the intention of never coming back. The wagon moved slowly, the wheels crunching through the thin layer of snow that was beginning to accumulate on the road. Ophelia kept her eyes forward, her hands tight on the reins. She tried not to think about what she was leaving behind. She tried not to think about the look in Kieran's eyes when he had asked her if there was a reason to stay. She tried to focus on the future, on California, on the new life that was waiting for her. She had been traveling for perhaps half an hour when she heard the hoofbeats again. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the sound grew louder, more urgent, and when she turned to look over her shoulder, she saw him. Kieran was riding hard, his horse's hooves throwing up clods of snow and mud. He was leaning forward in the saddle, his face set with determination. Ophelia's heart began to race. She pulled back on the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt, and waited as he closed the distance between them. He reined in beside her, his horse breathing hard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other, and Ophelia felt something crack open inside her chest. "Do not leave," Kieran said. His voice was raw, desperate in a way she had never heard before. "Please, Ophelia." "Do not leave." "Why not?" she asked. Her own voice was shaking. "Because I love you," he said, and the words came out in a rush as if he had been holding them back for years. "I have loved you for as long as I can remember. I love the way you laugh when something truly delights you. I love the way you talk to the horses like they are people. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you never back down from a challenge. I love you, Ophelia, and I cannot let you ride out of my life without telling you." The snow was falling all around them, turning the world into a soft white blur. Ophelia felt tears spilling down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. "You never said anything," she whispered. "All these years you never said anything." "I know," Kieran said. He dismounted and came to stand beside the wagon, looking up at her with those impossibly blue eyes. "I was a coward. I thought I had time. I thought there would always be another dance, another church picnic, another chance to tell you how I felt. But then your father died, and I realized that time is not promised to anyone. And I knew that if I let you leave without telling you the truth, I would regret it for the rest of my life." Ophelia climbed down from the wagon on shaking legs. She stood in front of him, so close she could see the snowflakes melting in his hair, could see the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. "I have to go," she said, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. "I cannot stay here. There are too many memories, too much pain." "Then I will come with you," Kieran said without hesitation. "If you want to go to California, I will go to California. If you want to go to Oregon or Montana or all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, I will follow you. Just do not ask me to let you go." "You have a job here," Ophelia said weakly. "You have a life." "My life is wherever you are," Kieran said. He reached out and took her hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused, familiar in a way that made her heart ache. "I mean it, Ophelia. I will leave everything behind if it means I get to be with you." She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. No hesitation, no doubt, just pure, unwavering love. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The grief that had been crushing her since her father's death did not disappear, but it made room for something else. Hope, joy. The possibility of a future that did not look quite so bleak. "I love you too," she said, and the words felt like a confession and a prayer all at once. "I have loved you for so long, Kieran, but I am broken right now. I do not know if I can be what you need." "You do not have to be anything but yourself," Kieran said. He let go of her hands and reached up to cup her face, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. "We will figure it out together. Whatever you need, wherever you want to go, I am with you. Always." And then he kissed her, and it was like coming home. His lips were soft and warm despite the cold, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all of her grief and fear and love into that single moment. The snow fell around them, silent and steady, blanketing the world in white. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Kieran rested his forehead against hers, and Ophelia closed her eyes, savoring the closeness, the feeling of being held and cherished and understood. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "That depends," Kieran said. "Do you still want to go to California?" Ophelia thought about it. The idea of running away, of starting over in a place where no one knew her pain, was still appealing. But the idea of staying, of building a life with Kieran in a place that held both her worst memories and her best ones, was equally compelling. She realized that what she had been running from was not the place itself, but the loneliness, and she was not lonely anymore. "I do not know," she admitted. "I do not know if I can stay in Taylorsville, but I do not know if I need to go all the way to California either." "Then let us compromise," Kieran said. He pulled back slightly so he could look at her. "Let us go somewhere new but not so far away. There are other towns in Utah, other places we could start fresh. We could find a piece of land and build something together. A ranch, maybe. You could raise horses like your father did and I could help. We could make a life that is ours, not weighed down by the past." The idea sparked something in Ophelia's chest. A ranch. A new place. A fresh start, but not one that required her to leave everything behind. She could still visit her father's grave. She could still hold onto the good memories of this place. But she would not have to live in the shadow of her grief. "There is a valley I heard about," she said slowly. "East of here near the Wyoming border. Open range, good water, plenty of grass. It is supposed to be beautiful." "Then let us go there," Kieran said, and he smiled at her, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Let us go build our future." They stood there for a moment longer, just holding each other in the falling snow. Then Kieran went back to his horse and grabbed his saddlebags. "I will need to go back to the Miller Ranch and collect my things," he said. "And I will need to tell them I am leaving, but I can be ready to go by tomorrow morning." "Are you sure about this?" Ophelia asked. "You are giving up everything for me." "I am not giving up anything," Kieran said firmly. "I am gaining everything I ever wanted." He kissed her again, quick and sweet, and then he swung back into his saddle. "Go back to your ranch for tonight. I will come for you at first light and we will leave together. I promise." Ophelia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched him ride away back toward town, and then she climbed onto the wagon and turned it around. The ranch looked different when she pulled into the yard this time. It still held memories, both good and painful, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place she was choosing to leave behind, rather than a place she was running from. That night, she lay in her bed and thought about the future. She thought about Kieran, about the feel of his hands on her face and the sound of his voice saying he loved her. She thought about the valley he had described, the open range and the good water and the possibility of a new beginning. She thought about the horses she would raise and the life they would build together. And for the first time since her father had died, she felt something other than grief. She felt anticipation. She felt hope. She felt love. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses in the yard. When she looked out the window, she saw Kieran waiting for her, mounted on his horse with a pack horse trailing behind. The snow had stopped during the night, and the world was pristine and white, sparkling in the early morning light. Ophelia dressed quickly and gathered her things. She took one last walk through the house, saying goodbye to the rooms where she had laughed and cried and grown up. She ran her hand along the kitchen table where she had eaten breakfast with her father every morning. She paused in the doorway of his bedroom, remembering the sound of his voice reading to her when she was small. And then she walked out the front door and locked it behind her, leaving the key under a rock for the neighbor who would sell the property. Kieran dismounted when he saw her and came to help her with her bags. He loaded them onto the pack horse with practiced efficiency, and then he turned to her with a smile. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said. He helped her onto Ruby, and then he climbed onto his own horse. They rode out together, side by side, following the road east as the sun rose behind them, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Ophelia looked back once at the ranch, at the place that had been her home for 22 years, and then she turned her face forward and did not look back again. The journey to the valley took them 3 days. They traveled slowly, taking their time, stopping to rest the horses and to eat meals cooked over a small campfire. At night, they slept under the stars, bundled in blankets and lying close together for warmth. Kieran was a perfect traveling companion, patient and steady, always seeming to know when Ophelia needed to talk and when she needed silence. They spoke about everything and nothing. He told her stories about working at the Miller Ranch, about the cowboys he had ridden with, and the cattle drives he had been on. She told him about her father, about the horses they had trained together, and the dreams he had held for the ranch. Sometimes they rode in comfortable quiet, just enjoying the beauty of the landscape and the pleasure of each other's company. On the second night, as they lay beside the fire, Kieran reached out and took her hand. "I want to marry you," he said quietly. "When we get to the valley, I want to find a preacher and make you my wife, if you will have me." Ophelia turned to look at him. His face was serious in the firelight, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, long and slow, and she felt the last of her walls crumble. She had spent so long trying to be strong, trying to carry her grief alone, but she did not have to do that anymore. She had Kieran now, and he would help her carry the weight. They reached the valley on the afternoon of the third day, and Ophelia knew immediately that this was where they were meant to be. It was everything the rumors had promised and more. The valley stretched out before them, wide and green even under its blanket of snow, with a river running through the center and mountains rising on all sides. There were stands of cottonwood and aspen along the riverbanks, their bare branches stark against the white landscape. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the call of a hawk circling overhead. "It is perfect," Ophelia breathed. "It is," Kieran agreed. He pointed to a spot near the river where the land rose slightly, providing a good view of the valley. That would be a good place to build a house. High enough to avoid flooding, but close enough to the water for easy access. They rode down into the valley and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. They found tracks in the snow from deer and elk. They found wild roses growing along the riverbank, their branches bare now but promising beautiful blooms in the spring. They found a natural spring that bubbled up from the rocks, providing fresh, clean water year-round. By the time the sun began to set, Ophelia was more certain than ever that this was the right decision. They made camp that night near the spot Kieran had pointed out for the house. As they sat by the fire, eating beans and cornbread, Ophelia felt a sense of peace settle over her. This place felt like a gift, like something precious that had been waiting for them all along. "We will need to file a claim on the land," Kieran said, his voice practical. "And we will need supplies. Lumber for a house, tools, seed for planting. We will have to go to the nearest town, wherever that is." "There is a settlement about 20 miles north of here," Ophelia said. She had studied the maps before they left, wanting to know exactly where they were going. "A place called Bridger. It is small, but it should have what we need." "Then we will go there tomorrow," Kieran said. "We will file the claim, buy supplies, and find a preacher." That night, they made love for the first time. It was sweet and tender and a little awkward, both of them fumbling in the darkness, but it was also perfect in its own way. Kieran was gentle with her, patient, taking his time to learn what she liked. And Ophelia felt something inside her heal, just a little, as she gave herself to him completely. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of the river in the distance. "I love you," Kieran whispered against her hair. "I love you too," Ophelia whispered back. They left for Bridger early the next morning. The settlement was indeed small, just a handful of buildings clustered around a single street, but it had everything they needed. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, and a church with a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. They filed their claim at the land office, paying the fee with money Ophelia had received from selling her horses. Then they went to the general store and spent the rest of the afternoon selecting supplies. Lumber, nails, a new saw, sacks of flour and sugar and coffee, blankets, a Dutch oven, seeds for a vegetable garden. The list seemed endless, but Kieran worked through it methodically, making sure they had everything they would need to survive the winter and get started in the spring. As the sun began to set, they found the preacher and asked him to marry them. He was an older man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, and he agreed without hesitation. They were married right there in the little church, with no witnesses except the preacher and God. Ophelia wore her traveling dress, still dusty from the road, and Kieran wore his work clothes. But when he took her hands and spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her for all the days of his life, she felt like the most beautiful bride in the world. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Kieran kissed her, she knew that she had found something she had not even known she was looking for. Home. Not a place, but a person. A partner who would stand beside her through whatever life brought. They spent their wedding night in the hotel, in a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out on the snowy street. Kieran carried her over the threshold, laughing when she protested that it was silly. And then he set her down gently and kissed her until her knees went weak. They made love again, and it was better this time, less awkward and more instinctive. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking in whispers about the future they would build. "I want to raise the best horses in the territory," Ophelia said, tracing patterns on Kieran's chest with her fingertips. "Horses that people will come from hundreds of miles to buy." "You will," Kieran said confidently. "You have your father's gift with them. I have seen the way they respond to you. It is like magic." "I want children too," Ophelia said softly. "Not right away, maybe, but someday. I want our house to be full of life and laughter." "How many children?" Kieran asked, smiling. "At least 3, Ophelia said. "Maybe more. I want them to have siblings, people they can rely on the way I wish I had been able to rely on someone after my mother died." "Then we will have a house full," Kieran promised. He kissed the top of her head. "Whatever you want, Ophelia. I will give you the world if I can." They returned to the valley the next day, the wagon loaded with supplies. The first order of business was building a shelter. It was too late in the season to construct a proper house, so they decided to put up a small cabin that would see them through the winter. Kieran had experience with carpentry, having helped build several barns and outbuildings at the Miller Ranch, and Ophelia proved to be a quick study. They worked from sunrise to sunset, sawing and hammering and fitting boards together. The work was hard and exhausting, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. Every nail Ophelia drove, every board she helped raise, felt like an act of creation. They were building their future with their own hands. The cabin took 2 weeks to complete. It was small and simple, just one room with a fireplace at one end and a loft for sleeping at the other, but it was solid and warm and theirs. On the day they finished, Kieran lifted Ophelia in his arms and carried her across the threshold for the second time, and they celebrated by cooking a proper meal and eating it at the small table they had built together. Winter settled over the valley in earnest after that. The snow fell regularly, piling up in drifts against the cabin walls and making travel difficult. But Ophelia and Kieran did not mind. They spent the long, dark days working on plans for the ranch, sketching out where the barn would go and where the corrals would be built. They read books by the firelight, sharing a single rocking chair that Kieran had made from scrap lumber. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. And they made love often, growing more comfortable with each other's bodies, learning the rhythms and pleasures of physical intimacy. As the weeks passed, Ophelia felt herself changing. The sharp edge of her grief began to dull, worn smooth by time and love. She still thought about her father every day. She still missed him with an ache that sometimes took her breath away, but she was learning to carry that loss without letting it define her. She was learning to be happy again, to find joy in small moments, the way Kieran looked at her over breakfast, the sound of his laughter when she told a joke, the feeling of his arms around her as they fell asleep each night. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fire, Ophelia realized that she had not thought about revenge in weeks. When her father had first been killed, she had been consumed by rage, by the need to see Harrison Webb and his men brought to justice. But somehow, without her even noticing, that rage had faded. She still believed that what had happened was wrong, that those men should be punished. But she no longer felt the need to be the one to punish them. She had found something better to focus her energy on, building a life, creating something good out of the ashes of tragedy. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked. He was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving with practiced ease. "My father," Ophelia said honestly. "And how different my life would have been if he had not been killed. I would still be at the ranch in Taylorsville. You and I might never have spoken about our feelings. We might have spent the rest of our lives dancing around each other, too afraid to take a chance." "That is a terrible thought," Kieran said. He set down his whittling and moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "But you are right. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best things. I hate that you lost your father. I hate that you had to go through that pain, but I am grateful that it led you to me." "I am grateful too," Ophelia said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think my father would have liked you. I think he would have been happy to know I was with someone who loves me the way you do." "I hope so," Kieran said quietly. "I never got to ask his permission to court you. I never got to promise him that I would take care of you. But I will spend the rest of my life honoring his memory by making you happy." Ophelia felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. She turned her face up to Kieran's and kissed him, pouring all of her gratitude and love into that simple gesture. Spring came to the valley in a rush of green and gold. The snow melted, turning the river into a roaring torrent. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, carpeting the ground in purple and yellow and red. The cottonwoods leafed out, their branches rustling in the warm breeze. And Ophelia and Kieran threw themselves into the work of building their ranch. They started with a barn, larger and more substantial than the cabin. It took them most of April and May to complete, working long days that left them sunburned and sore. But when it was finished, Ophelia stood back and looked at it with pride. It was a beautiful building, sturdy and well made, with room for a dozen horses and a loft for storing hay. Next came the corrals, built with posts of pine and aspen that Kieran cut from the trees along the river. He was good with his hands, patient and precise, and Ophelia found herself watching him work with a mixture of admiration and desire. There was something undeniably attractive about seeing him stripped to the waist in the warm sun, his muscles flexing as he drove posts into the ground and strung wire between them. In early June, they made a trip back to Taylorsville. Ophelia had been nervous about returning, afraid of how it would feel to see the place where so much had happened. But when they rode into town, she found that it had lost its power over her. It was just a town, a collection of buildings and people, nothing more. They went to the bank, where Ophelia collected the money from the sale of her father's ranch. It was a substantial sum, more than enough to finish building their ranch and buy their first horses. They also visited the cemetery, where Ophelia laid flowers on her father's grave and introduced him to Kieran, speaking to the headstone as if her father could hear her. "This is Kieran," she said, kneeling in the grass. "The man I told you about when I was 16, the one I thought was so handsome. We are married now. We have a ranch in the valley and we are going to raise horses, just like you taught me. I wish you could be there to see it. I wish you could meet him and shake his hand and give us your blessing. But I think you know, wherever you are, I think you are happy for me." Kieran knelt beside her and placed his own hand on the headstone. "I will take care of her, sir," he said quietly. "I promise you that. She will never want for anything as long as I am alive." They left Taylorsville that afternoon and returned to the valley. As they rode through the gates of their property, Ophelia felt a deep sense of rightness. This was home now. This was where her future lay. Throughout the summer, they worked tirelessly. They planted a vegetable garden and watched it flourish in the rich valley soil. They built a chicken coop and bought a flock of hens, enjoying the luxury of fresh eggs every morning. They dug a well near the house, ensuring they would have water even if the river ran low. And in August, they made their first big purchase: a breeding stallion and 3 mares, all of them Mustangs that had been caught wild and partially broken. Ophelia spent weeks working with them, using the techniques her father had taught her, gaining their trust and teaching them to accept the saddle and bridle. It was hard, sometimes frustrating work, but it was also deeply satisfying. These horses were the foundation of their future, and she treated them with the respect and care they deserved. By the time autumn arrived, the ranch was starting to look like a real operation. The barn was full of horses, their coats gleaming with health. The garden had yielded a bounty of vegetables that Ophelia spent weeks canning and preserving for the winter. The cabin, though still small, was cozy and well-stocked, and Ophelia and Kieran had settled into a rhythm of life that felt as natural as breathing. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Ophelia realized that she had something important to tell Kieran. She had suspected for a few weeks, but now she was certain. Her monthly cycle, always regular, had not come. Her breasts were tender and she had been feeling queasy in the mornings. She was pregnant. "Kieran," she said, and something in her tone made him turn to look at her immediately. "What is it?" he asked, concern flickering across his face. "I am going to have a baby," Ophelia said. The words came out in a rush, and she watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then a smile broke across his face, so wide and joyful that it made her heart swell. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Ophelia said, laughing at his excitement. "In the spring, I think. April or May." Kieran let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down carefully as if she were made of glass and placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said again, his voice full of wonder. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Ophelia asked, though the answer was written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Kieran said. He kissed her, soft and sweet. "You have given me everything, Ophelia. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into the winter. Ophelia continued to work with the horses, though Kieran fretted constantly that she was doing too much. She assured him that she was fine, that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, and that a little hard work would not hurt her. But she did agree to let him take over some of the heavier tasks, and she appreciated his protectiveness, even when it bordered on overbearing. As her belly grew, so did their anticipation. They spent the long winter evenings preparing for the baby's arrival. Kieran built a cradle from smooth pine, carving delicate patterns into the headboard. Ophelia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small they were. They debated names, arguing playfully about whether they liked traditional names or more unusual ones. If it was a boy, Kieran wanted to name him after Ophelia's father. If it was a girl, Ophelia wanted to name her after Kieran's mother, who had passed away when he was young. The baby came on a warm day in late April, when the valley was alive with the sounds and scents of spring. Ophelia's labor started just after dawn, and she labored through the day with Kieran at her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. There was no doctor nearby, so they had asked a woman from Bridger, a midwife named Martha, to come stay with them as the due date approached. Martha was calm and competent, guiding Ophelia through the process with steady reassurance. The baby was born just as the sun was setting, filling the cabin with golden light. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the entire valley. Kieran cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and then he placed the baby in Ophelia's arms. "He is perfect," Ophelia whispered, gazing down at her son. "He is absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Kieran asked. "Owen," Ophelia said without hesitation. "Owen Kieran Jennings, after his grandfather and his father." "Owen," Kieran repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Owen. Welcome to the world." The first few weeks with Owen were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. But even through the exhaustion, Ophelia felt a joy she had never known before. This tiny person, this new life, was a piece of her and Kieran, a symbol of their love and their future. She watched Kieran hold his son with such tenderness, such awe, and she fell in love with him all over again. As spring turned to summer, they settled into a new rhythm. Ophelia cared for Owen while Kieran worked the ranch. But whenever he had a spare moment, Kieran would come inside to hold his son, talking to him in a soft voice about the horses and the valley and all the things they would do together when Owen was older. Ophelia would watch them and feel her heart overflow with gratitude. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine, the loss of her father, and somehow she had found her way to this. A family, a home, a life filled with love. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Word spread about the quality of the horses Ophelia was raising, and people began coming from all over the territory to buy from them. Some came from as far away as Wyoming and Colorado, drawn by the reputation of the Jennings ranch. Ophelia took pride in every horse she sold, knowing that she was carrying on her father's legacy in her own way. When Owen was a year old, Ophelia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she was not surprised. She and Kieran had talked about wanting more children, and they were both thrilled at the prospect. The second pregnancy was harder than the first. Ophelia was chasing after a toddler now, and she found herself more tired, more worn down. But Kieran stepped up, taking over more of the household chores and caring for Owen so that Ophelia could rest. Their second child, a daughter, was born in February, during a fierce snowstorm that kept them all trapped in the cabin for 3 days. They named her Clara, after the wild roses that grew along the river, and she had Ophelia's green eyes and Kieran's easy smile. Owen, now a sturdy little boy, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to touch her and bring her toys. Ophelia would find him sitting beside the cradle, telling Clara stories in his own toddler language, and her heart would melt. Life settled into a pattern that was both predictable and deeply satisfying. The ranch continued to thrive. Kieran and Ophelia worked side by side, raising their children and their horses, building a life that was everything they had dreamed of. They had hard times, of course. There were droughts and harsh winters, illnesses and accidents. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. When Owen was 4 and Clara was 2, Ophelia found herself pregnant for a third time. This time, she gave birth to twin boys, which was both a blessing and a challenge. They named the twins Samuel and Thomas, and they were identical in every way except temperament. Samuel was quiet and thoughtful, content to sit and watch the world go by. Thomas was loud and adventurous, always getting into trouble. Ophelia and Kieran often joked that the twins had split one normal personality between them, one getting all the caution and the other getting all the recklessness. As the children grew, they became part of the ranch in their own ways. Owen learned to ride almost before he could walk, and by the time he was 6, he was helping Ophelia train the horses. Clara had her mother's way with animals, and she could calm even the most skittish foal with just her voice and gentle hands. Samuel loved the land itself, spending hours exploring the valley and learning about the plants and animals that lived there. Thomas, true to form, was the daredevil, always pushing boundaries and testing limits, but his bravery also made him fearless when it came to breaking wild horses. Ophelia watched her children grow and felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and sadness. They were growing up so fast, these 4 miracles who had come from her and Kieran's love. She wished her father could have met them, could have seen the ranch they had built and the family they had created. But she talked about him often to the children, telling them stories about their grandfather, about his skill with horses and his kind heart. She wanted them to know where they came from, to understand that they were part of a legacy that stretched back before they were born. Kieran was an incredible father. He was patient and loving, always willing to play or read stories or teach his children new skills. He worked long hours to provide for the family, but he never missed a bedtime or a family meal. Ophelia would sometimes watch him with the children and feel overwhelmed by her love for him. He had given her everything. He had pulled her back from the edge of despair and shown her that life could still be beautiful, even after tragedy. As the years passed, the ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. People came from hundreds of miles away to buy Jennings horses, and Ophelia's reputation as a trainer grew. She never forgot the lessons her father had taught her, and she passed those lessons on to her children and to the occasional apprentice who came to learn from her. The ranch employed several hands now, cowboys who helped with the daily work and the seasonal roundups. But it was always a family operation at its heart, with Ophelia and Kieran at the center, their children working alongside them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kieran surprised Ophelia by taking her back to the spot where they had first kissed, where he had ridden after her in the snow, and told her he loved her. It was summer now, and the place looked completely different, green and lush instead of white and frozen. But Ophelia remembered it perfectly. She remembered the way her heart had stopped when she heard his horse coming after her, the way his voice had sounded when he said her name, the way the world had seemed to tilt on its axis when he told her he loved her. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked as they stood together, hand in hand. "Agreeing to stay, marrying me." Ophelia turned to look at him, this man who had become the center of her world. His face was more weathered now than it had been a decade ago, lined from years of working in the sun. But his eyes were the same, that startling blue-gray that had captivated her from the first time she saw him across a schoolroom. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single second. You saved me, Kieran. When I was drowning in grief and ready to run away from everything, you gave me a reason to stay. You gave me a life worth living. How could I ever regret that?" "I feel the same way," Kieran said. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Ophelia. You and our children and this life we have built. I fall in love with you more deeply every single day." They stood there for a long time, just holding each other, remembering where they had been and marveling at where they were now. Then they rode back to the ranch together, to the house they had built and expanded over the years, to the children who were waiting for them, to the life that stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. The children grew and eventually started lives of their own. Owen married a girl from Bridger and took over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Clara married a veterinarian and settled in a nearby town, though she came home often to help with the horses. Samuel went east to study agriculture and returned with new ideas about land management and conservation. Thomas, true to form, joined the cavalry and had adventures all over the West before finally settling down with a schoolteacher and starting his own horse breeding operation in Montana. Ophelia and Kieran became grandparents and then great-grandparents. They watched the ranch pass to the next generation, secure in the knowledge that it would continue long after they were gone. They grew old together, their love deepening and maturing like fine wine. They had arguments sometimes, moments of frustration or disagreement, but they always came back to each other. They always remembered what they had survived together, what they had built together. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren running everywhere, filling the house and yard with noise and laughter. Ophelia, now 72 years old, sat on the porch with Kieran, who was 76, and watched the chaos with a contented smile. "Can you believe this?" she asked, gesturing at the crowd. "All of these people, all of this life came from us." "I can believe it," Kieran said. He took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "We started with nothing but love and determination. We built something that will last for generations." "I wish my father could see it," Ophelia said quietly. It was a thought she had had many times over the years, and the ache of his absence had never completely faded. But it was a gentle ache now, softened by time and surrounded by so much joy that it could not overwhelm her. "I think he can," Kieran said. He squeezed her hand. "I think he is looking down from wherever he is, proud as can be of the woman you became and the family you created." Ophelia leaned her head on Kieran's shoulder, the same way she had done 1,000 times over the past 50 years. She thought about that day in the snow, when she had been ready to leave everything behind, and about the man who had ridden after her and changed the course of her life. She thought about all the years in between, the struggles and triumphs, the sorrows and joys. She thought about the children they had raised and the legacy they were leaving behind. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Kieran replied. "Always have. Always will." They sat together as the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Around them, their family laughed and played, carrying on the traditions and values that Ophelia and Kieran had worked so hard to instill. The ranch that had started with 2 people and a dream had become something magnificent, a testament to the power of love and perseverance. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ophelia felt a profound sense of peace. Her life had not been easy. She had known loss and pain and grief, but she had also known love, deep and true and lasting. She had found a partner who stood beside her through everything. She had built a family and a home and a legacy. And she had done it all in this beautiful valley, in this place that had welcomed her when she needed a new beginning. The snow had been falling when she said goodbye to her old life, ready to leave everything behind. Kieran had ridden after her, desperate and determined, telling her not to leave because he loved her. And that single moment, that single decision to stop and listen, to take a chance on love even when her heart was broken, had led to all of this. 50 years of marriage, 4 children, countless grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a ranch that was known throughout the West, a life that was full and rich and meaningful. Ophelia closed her eyes and sent a silent thank you to whatever forces had brought Kieran to her that day. "Thank you for not letting me run away. Thank you for giving me the courage to stay. Thank you for this man, this family, this beautiful, complicated, wonderful life." Kieran must have sensed what she was thinking because he pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked her so many years ago. "No regrets," Ophelia confirmed. She opened her eyes and looked out at the valley, at the mountains rising dark against the starlit sky, at the ranch that was her legacy and her home. Only gratitude. So much gratitude for every single moment. They stayed on the porch long after everyone else had gone inside, just the 2 of them, watching the stars and holding hands. They had weathered storms and droughts and the inevitable challenges that came with building a life from scratch. They had buried parents and friends and watched the world change around them. But through it all, they had each other. And that, Ophelia knew, was the greatest gift of all. When they finally went inside, the house was full of people sleeping wherever they could find space. Children were curled up on couches and floors, wrapped in blankets. The older grandchildren were playing quiet card games by lamplight. The adults were sitting around the kitchen table, talking in low voices and drinking coffee. It was chaos and it was perfect, and Ophelia would not have changed a single thing. She and Kieran made their way to their bedroom, the same room they had shared for decades, and got ready for bed. As they lay down together, Kieran pulled Ophelia close, and she settled into her familiar spot with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. 50 more years?" Kieran asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "If we are lucky," Ophelia replied. They did not get 50 more years. No one does. But they got a few more precious years together, and they made the most of every single day. They watched their grandchildren grow and start families of their own. They saw the ranch continue to prosper and evolve. They took long rides through the valley, revisiting all their favorite spots and making new memories. They sat on the porch every evening, holding hands and watching the sunset, counting their blessings. Kieran passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, with Ophelia beside him, holding his hand. She grieved him deeply, the way she had grieved her father all those years ago. But this time, the grief was tempered by the knowledge that she had been given an extraordinary gift. She had loved and been loved in return for more than half a century. She had built a life with him that mattered. She had no regrets. Ophelia lived for another 5 years after Kieran's death, surrounded by her family and continuing to offer her wisdom and guidance to the next generation. She spent her days in the barn with the horses, teaching her great-grandchildren the same lessons her father had taught her. She told stories about Kieran, keeping his memory alive for the children who had never known him. And she waited, patiently, for the day when she would be reunited with him. When she died, it was in the spring when the valley was at its most beautiful. She was in her bed in the room she had shared with Kieran, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were about him. "Tell Kieran I am coming," she whispered. "Tell him I love him." And then she closed her eyes and slipped away, a peaceful smile on her face. They buried her next to Kieran, on a hill overlooking the valley, where they could watch over the ranch they had built together for all eternity. The entire community came to the funeral, dozens and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Ophelia and Kieran in some way. They told stories and shared memories, and celebrated a life well lived. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own mark, but always honoring the foundation that Ophelia and Kieran had laid. The valley remained beautiful, a place of peace and possibility. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting and the mountains were painted in shades of gold, people swore they could see 2 figures on horseback, riding side by side through the meadows, their laughter carried on the wind. It was a love story that began with snow falling and a desperate ride through the cold. It was a story of grief transformed into hope, of tragedy giving way to joy. It was the story of 2 people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose love over fear, who built something lasting and beautiful together. And it was a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, love can light the way home.